Mike Thompson stood in his backyard, watching the last pieces of concrete being hauled away by the demolition crew. Where his swimming pool had been for the past 15 years, there was now just a large patch of dirt and a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in months. The July sun beat down on his sweaty forehead as he signed the final paperwork, officially ending what had become the most expensive headache of his life. The pool had been beautiful once. When Mike and his wife Sarah first bought the house in Meadowbrook Estates, the crystal-clear water and perfectly maintained deck had been the selling point. Their kids, Emma and Jake, had spent countless summer days splashing around while neighborhood friends joined them for pool parties and barbecues. Those were simpler times. Before the Homeowners Association became what Mike now considered a miniature dictatorship. The trouble started 3 years ago when the HOA board changed hands. The previous president, Mrs. Henderson, had been a reasonable woman who understood that homeowners had lives outside of maintaining their properties to magazine-perfect standards. When she moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren, her replacement brought a very different philosophy to the neighborhood. Karen Mitchell had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 5 years earlier, arriving with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and an attitude that suggested she viewed herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of property values. She was a woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move, even in strong wind. Her husband worked long hours as a traveling salesman, leaving Karen with plenty of time to patrol the streets looking for violations of the increasingly strict HOA rules. Within her first month as president, Karen had sent violation notices to 17 different houses. Mrs. Garcia down the street received a citation because her roses extended 6 inches beyond the approved planting boundary. The Johnson family got a warning because their basketball hoop was visible from the street, despite being in their own driveway. Even old Mr. Peterson, a retired veteran who kept his lawn like a golf course, received a notice because his American flag was allegedly the wrong size according to the new guidelines Karen had implemented. Mike had initially tried to stay out of the HOA drama. He attended the monthly meetings when he could, usually sitting in the back and scrolling through his phone while Karen droned on about paint color approvals and mailbox specifications. As a software engineer who worked from home, he appreciated the quiet neighborhood and didn't want to rock the boat. That philosophy changed when Karen decided his pool was a problem. The first notice came on a Tuesday morning in April. Mike found the official-looking envelope tucked under his windshield wiper when he went out to get his newspaper. The letter, written in Karen's characteristic formal tone, informed him that his pool equipment was in violation of Section 12.4.7 of the HOA guidelines, which stated that all mechanical equipment must be screened from view of neighboring properties. Mike read the letter twice, then walked around his backyard trying to figure out what Karen was talking about. His pool pump and filtration system were housed in a small utility shed that had been there when he bought the house. The shed was painted the same color as his house and tucked behind some landscaping. You could only see a small corner of it if you stood in a very specific spot in his neighbor's yard and craned your neck over the fence. He called Karen that afternoon, hoping to resolve the issue with a simple conversation. The call went exactly as well as he expected. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Mike Thompson on Elm Street. I got your notice about my pool equipment, and I'm a bit confused about what needs to be fixed." "Mr. Thompson," Karen's voice carried the tone of a school principal addressing a troublesome student. "I conducted my monthly inspection last week, and your equipment shed is clearly visible from the Henderson property. This creates an unsightly view that negatively impacts our neighborhood's aesthetic appeal." "But the Hendersons moved to Florida 3 years ago. That house has been empty since then." "That's irrelevant," Karen replied curtly. "The violation exists regardless of occupancy. You have 30 days to install additional screening or relocate the equipment to comply with our standards." Mike spent the next week getting quotes from landscapers and contractors. The cheapest solution would cost him $800 to install additional fencing and plants. The more expensive options ranged up to $3,000. For what amounted to hiding a shed that you could barely see anyway, it felt like highway robbery. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting to discuss the issue publicly. Maybe if other homeowners heard about the ridiculous expense being demanded, they would pressure Karen to be more reasonable. The meeting was held in the community center clubhouse, a generic beige room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs that made everything feel like a budget seminar. About 20 homeowners showed up, which was actually a good turnout for Meadowbrook Estates. Mike waded through 45 minutes of discussions about new speed bumps and updated holiday decoration policies before Karen finally allowed him to speak. "I want to address the violation notice I received about my pool equipment," Mike began, standing up from his seat in the third row. "The equipment in question has been in the same location for over 15 years, since before the current HOA guidelines were even written. It's barely visible and doesn't impact anyone's actual use or enjoyment of their property." Karen shuffled through her papers with exaggerated importance. "Mr. Thompson, ignorance of current regulations is not an excuse for noncompliance. The board voted unanimously to enforce all existing guidelines consistently and fairly. But the cost to fix this so-called violation is completely out of proportion to any actual benefit," Mike continued. "We're talking about potentially thousands of dollars to hide something that affects no one." "Property values," Karen replied, as if those two words settled the entire debate. "Our neighborhood's value depends on maintaining consistent standards. If we allow one violation, others will follow, and before you know it, Meadowbrook Estates will look like any ordinary subdivision." A few other homeowners voiced support for Mike's position. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she was facing a similar issue with her garden shed. Mr. Williams pointed out that the HOA Reserve Fund could probably use the money being spent on enforcement rather than demanding homeowners pay for cosmetic changes. But Karen had clearly made up her mind before the meeting even started. She called for a vote on whether to grant Mike an exception to the screening requirement. The vote failed 5-2, with the other board members falling in line behind their president. As Mike left the meeting that night, he felt frustrated and defeated. $800 might not break the bank, but it felt like giving in to a bully. He spent the drive home thinking about his options and coming up with increasingly creative ways to comply with Karen's demands while making his displeasure known. The solution came to him the next morning while he was drinking coffee and staring out at the pool. The HOA guidelines said the equipment had to be screened from neighboring properties, but they didn't actually require him to have a pool at all. What if he just removed the whole thing? The idea seemed crazy at first, but the more Mike thought about it, the more sense it made. Emma was now 16 and more interested in her part-time job than swimming. Jake had just turned 18 and would be leaving for college in the fall. Sarah had mentioned several times that she wouldn't mind having the extra backyard space for a garden. Most importantly, removing the pool would eliminate the need for expensive screening and solve the HOA problem permanently. Mike did his research over the next few weeks. A pool removal would cost about $4,000, but it would also eliminate the ongoing expenses of chemicals, maintenance, and increased utility bills. The long-term savings would actually be significant. Plus, he would never again have to worry about Karen finding new violations related to his pool equipment. He presented the idea to his family over dinner on a Friday night. "What would you guys think about getting rid of the pool?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Emma looked up from her phone with surprise. "Seriously? Why would we do that?" "Well, none of us really use it much anymore, and it would give us more space in the backyard. Plus, Mom could have that garden she's always talking about." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "This is about the HOA thing, isn't it?" Mike couldn't deny it. "Partly, yes. But I've been running the numbers, and it actually makes financial sense, too. We'd save money in the long run, and we wouldn't have to deal with any more surprise violations." Jake shrugged. I'm leaving for college anyway. Do whatever you want. After a week of family discussions, they decided to move forward with the pool removal. Mike got 3 quotes and scheduled the work for the first week of July. He didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood about his plans, partly because he wanted to avoid unsolicited opinions, but mostly because he was curious to see how Karen would react. The demolition took 4 days. Mike had expected some attention from neighbors, since the concrete breaking and dirt hauling made quite a bit of noise. A few people stopped by to ask what was happening, and most of them seemed to understand his reasoning once he explained the HOA situation. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought him a pitcher of iced tea on the second day. "Good for you," she said, while watching the workers break up the concrete pool deck. "I'm so tired of being told what I can and can't do with my own property." By Thursday afternoon, the pool was completely gone. Mike stood in his backyard with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't expected. The space looked bigger without the pool, and Sarah was already making plans for raised garden beds and a small patio area. It felt like they had taken control of their own property again, instead of living at the mercy of an overzealous HOA board. Mike was inside making dinner when he heard the doorbell ring. He glanced at the clock and saw it was just past 6 o'clock. Sarah answered the door, and Mike could hear her talking to someone on the front porch. The tone sounded formal and not particularly friendly. "Mike," Sarah called from the hallway, "Karen Mitchell wants to speak with you." Mike wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. Karen was standing on his porch, wearing a white business suit and carrying her ever-present clipboard. Her expression suggested she was not there for a friendly neighborhood chat. "Good evening, Mrs. Mitchell. What can I help you with?" "Mr. Thompson, I need to discuss the unauthorized construction that took place at your residence this week." Mike felt a surge of irritation. "What unauthorized construction?" "I removed my pool, which required no permits and violates no HOA guidelines." "On the contrary," Karen replied, flipping through papers on her clipboard. Section 15.2.3 clearly states that any significant landscape modifications must be approved by the Architectural Committee before work begins. Removing a pool certainly qualifies as a significant modification. Mike stared at her for a long moment. "You've got to be kidding me. I removed the pool to solve the equipment screening issue you complained about. Now you're saying I needed permission to solve a problem you created?" "The violation notice gave you several approved options for addressing the equipment screening issue. Pool removal was not among those options, because it wasn't necessary to list every possible solution. The problem was that you could see the equipment. Now there's no equipment to see. Problem solved." Karen's expression remained stern and official. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The modification was completed without proper approval, which constitutes a violation of our guidelines. You'll need to submit an after-the-fact application for review, along with the standard processing fee." Mike felt his blood pressure rising. "How much is this processing fee?" $250, plus any additional costs if the committee determines that remediation is necessary." "Remediation? What kind of remediation?" "That would depend on the committee's assessment. They might require specific landscaping, grading, or other improvements to ensure the modification meets neighborhood standards." Mike looked at Karen standing on his porch in her business suit, holding her clipboard like a shield, and realized that this was never going to end. No matter what he did to comply with one rule, she would find another rule that he was somehow violating. The HOA had become her personal kingdom, and she intended to rule it with an iron fist. "I'll think about it," he said finally, and closed the door. Mike spent the weekend researching HOA laws and reading through the Meadowbrook Estates guidelines with a fine-tooth comb. What he discovered made his frustration turn into genuine anger. The section Karen had quoted about landscape modifications was buried on page 47 of a 60-page document that had been updated 6 months earlier. More importantly, The language was vague enough to potentially apply to almost any yard work, from planting flowers to trimming bushes. He also found several inconsistencies in how the rules were being enforced. The Johnsons had installed a new deck last spring without any HOA approval, yet they had never received a violation notice. The Rodriguez family had completely redone their front landscaping, removing old shrubs and adding new flower beds with no apparent consequences. It seemed like Karen's enforcement was selective, possibly targeting homeowners who had previously questioned her authority. By Monday morning, Mike had made his decision. He wasn't going to pay the processing fee, and he wasn't going to submit an after-the-fact application. His pool removal was legal, reasonable, and beneficial to the neighborhood. If Karen wanted to fight about it, he would fight back. The second violation notice arrived on Tuesday, delivered by certified mail. This one was more aggressive in tone, threatening fines of $50 per day until the issue was resolved. It also included a demand that Mike appear before the architectural committee the following Thursday to discuss compliance options. Mike called his neighbor Mrs. Patterson that evening to vent his frustrations. She had been dealing with her own HOA battles and had become something of an unofficial support group for homeowners fed up with Karen's increasingly authoritarian approach. "She's completely out of control," Mrs. Patterson said during their phone conversation. "Did you know she tried to fine the Martins because their newspaper was sitting in their driveway at 10 in the morning? Apparently, newspapers are supposed to be retrieved by 8 a.m. according to some guideline I've never heard of." "This has to be illegal somehow," Mike replied. "There's got to be some limit to what an HOA can actually enforce." "I've been thinking the same thing. My cousin lives in a neighborhood that had similar problems with their HOA. They ended up getting a lawyer involved, and it turned out the board was overstepping their authority in several ways." Mike had been avoiding the idea of legal action because of the expense, but Mrs. Patterson's comment got him thinking. Maybe it was time to at least consult with an attorney to understand his rights. The architectural committee meeting on Thursday was held in Karen's living room, which immediately struck Mike as inappropriate. The committee consisted of Karen, her friend Linda Williams from 2 streets over, and Bob Chen, a newer resident who seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. Karen had prepared what looked like a formal presentation, complete with printed photos of Mike's backyard taken from various angles. She had somehow managed to get pictures from inside his neighbors' yards, which Mike found both impressive and creepy. "As you can see from these images," Karen began, addressing the committee while Mike sat on her couch feeling like he was on trial. "The removal of the pool has created an unsightly dirt patch that significantly impacts the visual appeal of our neighborhood. Additionally, the grading appears to be uneven, which could lead to drainage issues affecting neighboring properties." Mike looked at the photos and saw his backyard, which admittedly was still mostly dirt, but was hardly the environmental disaster Karen was describing. "The area is going to be landscaped," he said. "We're planting garden beds and new grass. This is just the interim condition while the ground settles." "That's precisely the problem," Karen replied. "Major landscape modifications require pre-approval, so the committee can ensure the final result meets neighborhood standards. By removing the pool without approval, you've created a situation where we have no control over the final outcome." Bob Chen spoke up for the first time. "What if Mr. Thompson submits plans for the new landscaping? If the committee approves the plans, couldn't we consider the pool removal as part of an overall improvement project?" Mike felt a surge of hope. Bob seemed to be offering a reasonable compromise. Karen, however, was not interested in compromise. "The violation has already occurred, Bob. We can't retroactively approve something that was done without permission. That would set a precedent that homeowners can do whatever they want and ask for forgiveness later." "But if the end result improves the property and meets our standards, what's the actual harm?" Bob asked. "The harm is to our authority and our ability to maintain neighborhood standards," Karen replied, her voice rising slightly. "If we allow this violation to stand, What's to stop other homeowners from making unauthorized changes? Linda Williams, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke. I have to agree with Karen. Rules are rules, and they have to be enforced consistently. Mike realized the meeting was a formality. Karen had already decided what the committee's recommendation would be, and Linda was there to provide the illusion of consensus. Bob looked uncomfortable, but outnumbered. So what exactly are you proposing? Mike asked. Karen consulted her notes. The committee recommends a fine of $2,000 for the unauthorized modification, plus the standard processing fee for after-the-fact review. Additionally, you'll need to submit detailed landscaping plans for approval before any further work is done in the affected area. Mike stood up from the couch. $2,000 for removing something from my own property that wasn't even required to be there in the first place? The amount reflects the seriousness of the violation and serves as a deterrent to prevent similar incidents in the future. This is insane. I solved the problem you complained about, and now you want to fine me $2,000 for solving it the wrong way. You solved it without proper authorization, Karen replied calmly. That's the issue here. Mike left the meeting feeling like he had just experienced a kangaroo court. The whole process had been designed to reach a predetermined conclusion, with no real opportunity for discussion or compromise. He drove home planning his next move. That evening, Mike called the attorney Mrs. Patterson had recommended. The lawyer, David Martinez, specialized in HOA disputes and agreed to review Mike's case for a consultation fee of $200. After hearing the details, Martinez was optimistic. This sounds like selective enforcement and possible overreach of authority, Martinez explained during their phone call. HOAs have legitimate powers, but they can't just make up rules as they go along. If you want to fight this, I think you have a good chance of success. Mike decided to hire Martinez to represent him. The legal fees would probably cost more than just paying Karen's fines, but the principle mattered more than the money at this point. If Karen could bully him into paying $2,000 for removing his own pool, what would she demand next? Martinez sent a formal response to the HOA board, disputing the fines and requesting a hearing before the full board, rather than just the architectural committee. He also requested copies of all HOA documents, meeting minutes, and records of enforcement actions against other homeowners. Karen's response came within 3 days, and it was not what Mike had expected. Instead of agreeing to a board hearing, she escalated the situation dramatically. Mike was working in his home office on Friday afternoon when Sarah called out from the kitchen. "Honey, there are police cars in our driveway." Mike looked out his window and saw 2 patrol cars parked in front of his house. His heart started racing as he tried to figure out what could possibly be wrong. Had there been a break-in? An accident involving one of the kids? He met the officers at his front door. There were 3 of them, 2 uniformed patrol officers and a detective in plain clothes. All 3 looked like they would rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Thompson," the detective asked. "I'm Detective Rodriguez. We need to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed regarding your property." "A complaint? What kind of complaint?" "Ma'am Mitchell from your homeowners association has filed charges alleging destruction of property and violation of local ordinances. She claims you've created a safety hazard by improperly removing a swimming pool without permits." Mike stared at the detective. "She called the police because I removed my own pool?" "According to the complaint, the removal created unstable ground conditions that could affect neighboring properties. She also alleges that debris from the demolition may have damaged drainage systems." "That's completely false. I hired licensed contractors who pulled all the proper permits from the city. Everything was done by the book." Detective Rodriguez looked down at his notes. "Do you have documentation of the permits and contractor licenses?" "Of course I do. Let me get them." Mike invited the officers inside while he retrieved his file folder containing all the paperwork from the pool removal. The city building permit, the contractor's license and insurance information, the inspection reports, everything was in order and properly documented. The detective reviewed the documents while the two patrol officers looked around awkwardly. One of them kept glancing toward the backyard like he was expecting to see a giant hole or something dangerous. "This all looks legitimate," Detective Rodriguez said after a few minutes. "The permits are valid and the inspections were completed properly. I'm not seeing any safety violations here." "So what happens now?" Mike asked. "Well, this appears to be a civil matter between you and your HOA. The criminal allegations don't seem to be supported by evidence. I'll need to file a report, but I don't anticipate any charges being filed." Mike felt relieved, but also angry. "Officer, can I ask you something? Is it normal for HOA disputes to involve police calls?" Detective Rodriguez smiled wryly. "More common than you'd think, unfortunately. Some people think calling police will give their complaints more weight. Usually doesn't work that way." After the police left, Mike called his attorney to report what had happened. Martinez was not surprised by Karen's tactics. "This is actually good for your case," Martinez explained. "Filing false police reports to intimidate a neighbor could be considered harassment. It shows a pattern of escalating behavior that goes beyond reasonable HOA enforcement." Mike spent the weekend feeling violated and angry. Having police show up at his house over a pool removal felt like something out of a dystopian novel. Several neighbors had seen the police cars and asked what was wrong. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that Karen had actually called the cops on Mike for removing his pool. The reaction from other homeowners was overwhelmingly supportive of Mike's position. Mrs. Garcia stopped by on Saturday with a casserole and a story about her own run-ins with Karen. The Johnson family called to offer their support and mentioned they were considering selling their house because of the increasingly hostile HOA environment. Most significantly, Bob Chen from the Architectural Committee knocked on Mike's door on Sunday evening. "I wanted to apologize for what happened at the committee meeting," Bob said when Mike answered the door. "I should have spoken up more strongly. That fine is completely unreasonable." "I appreciate you saying that, but it's not your fault. Karen made it clear she wasn't interested in reasonable solutions." "That's actually why I'm here. I think it's time for some changes in the HOA board. There's going to be an election next month for 3 board positions, including the president. I wanted to see if you'd be interested in running." Mike had never considered running for the HOA board, but Bob's suggestion was intriguing. "Do you think there's actually a chance of winning against Karen? I've been talking to other homeowners, and a lot of people are fed up with her approach. The police thing was the last straw for a lot of folks. If we can get a slate of reasonable candidates together, I think we could win." Mike told Bob he would think about it. The idea of replacing Karen as HOA president was appealing, but it would also mean committing significant time and energy to neighborhood politics. That decision would have to wait, however, because Mike's immediate problem was far from over. On Monday morning, he found another certified letter waiting for him. This one wasn't from Karen or the HOA board. It was from the county zoning department, informing him that a complaint had been filed alleging unpermitted construction and zoning violations at his property. Someone had reported that he had filled in a swimming pool without proper approvals and created drainage problems that violated county regulations. Mike didn't have to guess who had filed the complaint. Karen had escalated again, and this time she was bringing the full weight of county government into their dispute. Mike realized that his simple decision to remove a pool had somehow turned into a full-scale war, and Karen was prepared to use every weapon at her disposal to win it. He called his attorney immediately. This fight was far from over. David Martinez was in his office by 7 a.m. when Mike called about the county zoning complaint. The attorney had dealt with enough HOA disputes to recognize escalating tactics when he saw them. "This is getting ridiculous," Martinez said after Mike read him the county letter. Filing false complaints with multiple government agencies could constitute harassment under state law. Karen's digging herself a deeper hole with every move she makes. The county zoning inspection was scheduled for Wednesday morning. Mike took the day off work to be present when Inspector Janet Walsh arrived at his house. Walsh was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been handling zoning issues for the county for over 20 years. She clearly had little patience for frivolous complaints. "Let's take a look at this alleged violation," Walsh said, consulting her tablet as they walked toward Mike's backyard. The complaint alleges unpermitted pool removal, improper fill material, and drainage violations affecting neighboring properties. Mike showed her the same documentation he had provided to the police: building permits, contractor licenses, inspection reports, and photographs of the work in progress. Walsh examined everything carefully, then spent 20 minutes walking around the former pool area with a measuring tape and soil probe. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "I'm not seeing any violations here. Your permits are in order, the work was inspected and approved, and the drainage appears to be functioning properly. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand zoning regulations or was deliberately wasting our time." "What happens when you file a false complaint?" Mike asked. "Well, frivolous complaints are supposed to incur a fee to discourage abuse of the system. But enforcement of that policy is pretty spotty, unfortunately. Mostly, we just close the case and move on." Inspector Walsh left after issuing Mike a letter confirming that no violations were found. Mike immediately scanned the letter and emailed it to his attorney, along with copies of all the other documentation showing that his pool removal had been completely legal and proper. Martinez was building a strong case for harassment, but he warned Mike that legal action could take months or even years to resolve. In the meantime, Karen was showing no signs of backing down from her increasingly aggressive tactics. The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. Mike received a call on Thursday evening from Emma, who was upset about something that had happened at her part-time job at the local grocery store. "Dad, something weird happened at work today," Emma said when she got home. Mitchell came through my checkout line, and she started asking me all these questions about our pool and whether you had gotten permission for the work. She said she was concerned about safety issues in the neighborhood." Mike felt his anger rising. It was one thing for Karen to target him directly, but involving his 16-year-old daughter crossed a line. "What did you tell her?" "I just said I didn't know anything about it and asked if she wanted paper or plastic bags. But she kept pushing, asking if I had noticed any problems with our yard or if neighbors had complained. It was really uncomfortable." Mike called Martinez immediately to report the incident. The attorney was as outraged as Mike was. "Interrogating your minor child about an ongoing dispute is completely inappropriate," Martinez said. "That's getting into stalking territory. We need to document this incident and consider filing for a restraining order." But Mike was already formulating a different plan. Bob Chen's suggestion about running for the HOA board was starting to look more attractive. If Karen wanted to turn their neighborhood into a battlefield, maybe it was time to challenge her directly where it mattered most: at the ballot box. Mike spent Friday evening walking through the neighborhood, talking to homeowners about their experiences with the current HOA board. What he discovered was eye-opening. Nearly every house he visited had a story about unreasonable enforcement actions, excessive fines, or arbitrary rule interpretations. Mrs. Patterson had received a violation notice because her garden gnome was allegedly too tall, according to lawn ornament guidelines. The Rodriguez family had been fined for parking their work van in their own driveway overnight. The elderly Mr. Peterson had been cited multiple times for minor infractions, like leaving his trash can out an hour too long or having pine needles on his walkway. Most disturbing was the pattern of selective enforcement. Houses where the owners were friends with Karen or served on HOA committees seemed to escape scrutiny entirely. Mrs. Williams, who served on the architectural committee with Karen, had a large boat parked in her driveway for months without any consequences, despite clear guidelines prohibiting recreational vehicle storage. By Sunday evening, Mike had commitments from 12 homeowners to support a slate of reform candidates in the upcoming election. Bob Chen agreed to run for president, Mike would run for vice president, and Mrs. Patterson would seek the treasurer position. Their platform was simple: reasonable enforcement, transparent decision-making, and an end to harassment tactics. The campaign, such as it was in a small suburban neighborhood, began immediately. Mike created a simple flyer outlining their positions and hand-delivered copies to every house in Meadowbrook Estates. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Karen, meanwhile, was not taking the challenge to her authority well. She began sending out her own campaign materials, warning homeowners about the dangers of electing radical elements who wanted to eliminate property standards entirely. She also increased her patrol activities, issuing violation notices to several homeowners who had publicly supported the reform candidates. The most dramatic incident occurred 2 weeks before the election. Mike was working in his newly landscaped backyard when he heard shouting from the front of his house. He walked around to find Karen standing in his driveway, taking photographs of his house with a professional-looking camera. "What are you doing?" Mike asked. "Documenting ongoing violations for my compliance report," Karen replied, without looking up from her camera. "What violations?" "My property is in perfect condition." Karen pointed at Mike's front door. "Your house number is mounted 2 inches to the left of center according to the architectural guidelines. Also, your mailbox post shows signs of weathering that constitute deferred maintenance." Mike looked at his house number, which had been in the same position for 15 years, and his mailbox, which looked exactly like every other mailbox in the neighborhood. "You're kidding, right?" "I take my responsibilities as HOA president very seriously, Mr. Thompson. Unlike some people, I believe in maintaining neighborhood standards." Sarah had come out to see what the commotion was about, and several neighbors were watching from their yards. Mike realized that Karen was making a public display of her authority, trying to show the neighborhood that she could still harass anyone who opposed her. "Get off my property," Mike said firmly. "If you want to document anything, you can do it from the public sidewalk." "I have every right to inspect properties for compliance issues," Karen replied, continuing to take photographs. "You have no right to be in my driveway without permission. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Karen finally lowered her camera and looked directly at Mike. "Go ahead and call them. We'll see who they believe. A responsible HOA president trying to maintain neighborhood standards, or someone who destroys property without permission." Mike pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Karen quickly gathered her things and left, but not before taking several more photographs from the sidewalk. The whole incident had been witnessed by at least 6 neighbors, and Mike knew it would be the talk of the neighborhood within hours. The police response was more supportive than Mike had expected. The same Detective Rodriguez who had responded to Karen's earlier complaint arrived within 10 minutes. "Let me guess," Rodriguez said as he got out of his patrol car. "HOA dispute?" Mike explained what had happened, and Rodriguez took notes while walking around the property. Several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk and offered their own accounts of Karen's behavior. "Here's the situation," Rodriguez told Mike. "She has a right to take photographs from public property, but she can't come onto your private property without permission. If she continues to harass you or your family, you can file for a restraining order. Given the pattern of behavior you've described, a judge would probably approve it." Mike decided to hold off on the restraining order until after the election. He didn't want to give Karen any ammunition to claim she was being persecuted for doing her job as HOA president. The final 2 weeks of the campaign were intense. Karen's supporters, mostly older residents who valued strict rule enforcement, organized their own door-to-door efforts. They argued that the reform candidates would turn Meadowbrook Estates into a rundown neighborhood where anything goes. Mike's group focused on documented cases of harassment and selective enforcement. They organized a town hall meeting where homeowners could share their experiences with the current board. Over 40 people attended, and the stories they told painted a clear picture of an HOA that had lost sight of its purpose. Mrs. Garcia talked about being fined $50 because her roses grew 6 inches beyond an arbitrary boundary line. Mr. Johnson described receiving violation notices for basketball equipment that was stored in his own garage but visible through an open door. Even some of Karen's former supporters expressed concerns about the increasingly punitive approach to neighborhood management. Karen attended the town hall but left early after several homeowners directly challenged her authority and decision-making. Her departure was seen as a sign of weakness by many attendees. Election Day finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October. Voting took place in the community center from noon to 8 p.m. Mike volunteered as an election monitor, spending the day watching neighbors he had gotten to know over the past month cast their ballots. The turnout was unprecedented for an HOA election. Over 60% of eligible homeowners voted, compared to the usual 20%. Both sides had done effective get-out-the-vote efforts, and the atmosphere at the polling place was tense but civil. Results were announced at 9 p.m. Bob Chen defeated Karen for president by a margin of 47 votes to 31. Mike won the vice president position, and Mrs. Patterson was elected treasurer. The reform candidates had won a decisive victory, taking 4 of the 5 board positions. Karen's concession was brief and gracious in public, but Mike could see the anger in her eyes. She clearly viewed this as a personal defeat rather than a policy disagreement. The new board's first meeting was held the following week. Their initial agenda focused on reviewing and revising the enforcement policies that had caused so much controversy. They established clear guidelines for when violations would be cited, created an appeals process for homeowners who felt they had been unfairly targeted, and eliminated many of the petty regulations that had been used to harass residents. Most importantly, they passed a resolution stating that all enforcement actions must be based on legitimate safety concerns or significant impacts on property values. Subjective aesthetic judgments would no longer be grounds for violation notices. Mike's own HOA fines were dismissed as part of a broader review of recent enforcement actions. The board found that several homeowners had been unfairly targeted and reversed dozens of citations and fines that had been issued over the past year. The legal case against Karen for harassment was quietly settled out of court. She agreed to pay Mike's attorney fees and signed an agreement prohibiting further retaliation. In exchange, Mike agreed not to pursue the matter further. Karen remained in the neighborhood but kept a much lower profile. She sold her house 6 months later and moved to a different subdivision, reportedly to be closer to her sister. Her departure was met with relief by most of her former neighbors. The transformation of Meadowbrook Estates was gradual but noticeable. Homeowners began taking better care of their properties voluntarily, without the threat of fines and harassment. The neighborhood association shifted its focus to organizing social events and maintaining common areas rather than policing minor violations. Mike's backyard became one of the showcase properties in the neighborhood. Sarah's garden flourished in the space where the pool had been, and they installed a small patio area perfect for entertaining. Neighbors frequently complimented them on how much better the space looked compared to the old pool setup. The entire experience taught Mike valuable lessons about community organizing and the importance of standing up to bullies. What had started as a simple property improvement project had turned into a neighborhood-wide movement for reasonable governance. Emma, now a senior in high school, wrote her college application essay about watching her father fight for principle rather than taking the easy way out. She learned that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting short-term conflict in order to achieve long-term justice. 2 years later, Mike still served as vice president of the HOA board. The neighborhood had achieved a balance between maintaining property values and respecting homeowner rights. Enforcement actions were rare and focused on legitimate issues like safety violations or property abandonment. Most importantly, Meadowbrook Estates had become a true community again rather than a collection of houses ruled by fear and arbitrary regulations. Neighbors knew each other. Children played freely in yards without worry about violating obscure rules, and homeowners felt proud of their neighborhood rather than constantly anxious about the next violation notice. Mike often reflected on how removing his swimming pool had inadvertently led to removing something much more important, a toxic leadership culture that had been poisoning his neighborhood for years. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes fighting back against unreasonable authority is the only way to restore common sense and community spirit. The empty space where his pool had been was now filled with Sarah's thriving vegetable garden, a testament to the positive changes that can emerge from standing up for what's right, even when the fight seems overwhelming. Every tomato and pepper they harvested reminded Mike that the struggle had been worth it, not just for his family, but for everyone who called Meadowbrook Estates home.